Good afternoon. Chief Justice Stephen Gonzalez is an American success story in capital letters. His father's side were refugees from the Mexican Revolution, and his mother's side were immigrants from Eastern Europe and Jewish. Born in LA, he attended Pitzer College and studied in Japan and China. He speaks Japanese, Spanish, some Mandarin Chinese, plus English. He received his JD from Berkeley Law School, where he met his wife, Michelle Gonzalez. Steve has done it all as a lawyer and judge, a prosecuting attorney for the city of Seattle, the U.S. attorney, civil private practice, a King County Superior Court judge for 10 years, and a justice of the Washington Supreme Court since 2012. He became Chief Justice in January. I will not take up his time to name all of the awards he has received, but some of the areas are Distinguished Service in Anti-Terrorism. How many of us can say that? Several Judge of the Year awards, Minority and Justice awards, and recognition for his work in access to justice, including interpreter services. As Chief Justice, he is the leader of the entire Washington State judicial system, serving as chair of the Board for Judicial Administration. I have watched his career as a dedicated, passionate, effective judicial leader with awe. Chief Justice Stephen Gonzalez.
Thank you, Faith, for the introduction. Thanks, everyone, for having me here today. I have a long association with Rotary, having received a scholarship in my youth from Rotary, and I am forever grateful for the educational opportunities that I enjoyed because of that. It was a pleasure to hear La Bamba at the opening. It's a favorite song of mine in the traditional form as well, from Veracruz. And as you heard, it was popularized by a rock artist, Ricardo Valenzuela, whose name was changed to Richie Valens to be more palatable to the white audience they hoped to sell his songs to. I'm hoping now we've reached a point in society where we can use our real names without fear of anti-Latino bias, although some of it we know still exists. Cinco de Mayo has been celebrated too among Mexican Americans. It's ironic to see its commercialization. It is used as a symbol of strength and resilience, resisting those who would marginalize us and deny us equality. So it became important to Mexican Americans who experienced discrimination in this country, and it was celebrated because of that. And I'll give you some examples of the things that Mexican Americans were resisting. In 1932, during the Depression, immigration was all but closed down. And accompanying that close of immigration, between 500,000 and 2 million Mexican Americans, mostly citizens, were forcefully deported from the Southwest and returned to Mexico. That's right, many of them were actually citizens of the United States, yet were deported. Similarly, in 1954, the United States implemented a program called Operation Wetback. Yes, that's actually what it was called in the vernacular. And it was designed to remove Latinos from the Southwest, and police were employed. Law enforcement officers, local police were employed to remove Mexican Americans, and approximately 3.7 million Mexicans were deported, many of them, again, citizens or residence holders during that operation, forcibly removed from the United States to Mexico. So it is celebrated, Cinco de Mayo, as a form of resistance to the unequal treatment that continued even beyond those examples that I have given you. So I'd like to go next to a poem. I'm not sure if many of your speakers recite poetry. Maybe you're used to this. It's not a very long one. It's by Max Reef. Wherever there are rules, which is to say, everywhere, gradations of warnings and penalties lead to a certain point. When the arm of force comes down like a mechanical thing, like one of those boxing gloves shooting out from a metal grid. A boy in the preschool play yard who refuses to put on shoes when the barefoot flag is not up is the same as a guy on the street who refuses to move on when the cops say move. Polite admonishments may come first, then more serious ones, an ultimatum, and finally a lift and carry over screams. The arm of the law carries out impersonal orders. It's an arm not connected to a heart. So I read that poem because it points out something I've been thinking about when we consider the judicial branch. I think we need to connect our arms to our hearts. The rule of law is not a mechanical application of a cudgel that we hold aloft, threatening a disobedient society who dares to contradict authority. I hope our authority is not so delicate that it cannot withstand disagreement, dissent, or even disdain. I am Stephen Gonzalez, Chief Justice of the Washington Supreme Court, as you've heard, since January. Born working class, first in my family to college. My leadership may be different. I'm not here to make people comfortable with the first person of color ever to be Chief Justice by being the same as all of the chiefs who've come before me. I don't come here with platitudes about the law or a sports analogy saying that we're calling balls and strikes, unless instead I'm saying that sometimes we get to define the very strike zone itself. I think we're being tested. We're being tested as humans, all of us. What does it mean to care for one another? This week, I was interviewed by a historian doing a story about the Supreme Court, and he asked me why I am an optimist in the face of the threats to our democracy. And he confessed that he is a bit pessimistic about our future. My answer is, what choice do we have about optimism? It's true we're being tested, but I don't think despair, despondency, or pessimism are going to help us through these difficult times. In Puebla, 2,000 Mexican troops defeated 6,000 French troops. 2,000 can beat 6,000. We can overcome odds even if they are not good. I choose optimism and resolve, and for the pessimists here, I hope you're wrong. But more than hoping, I will work every day to make sure that you're wrong. I'm not looking at this world, though, through rose-colored glasses. I recognize we have real problems. One is that we assume the law is the answer. We are often wrong. Law should be the last resort. As courts, we are trying to change and grow and be on the cutting edge and not just reactive. It's hard for a branch that usually is reactive, reacting to the cases filed and the motions made. But in the administration of the judicial branch, we need to be more than passive and reactive. In June of last year, we issued an open letter calling on all of us to end the racial inequities that exist and are in some ways built in to our justice system. To follow through on that commitment, we have done a number of things. We have addressed some of our past cases that have used derogatory, hateful language towards groups. We overturned Tausnut, which was a case that was against a member of the Yakima Nation for fishing, which used disparaging remarks and referred to Native Americans as savages. We overturned a case that had upheld the right of a cemetery to exclude Blacks and Black children from being buried alongside of white children. We have started the Racial Justice Consortium to address systemic racism within our justice system. We have adopted court rules to reduce the elimination of potential jurors of color, to exclude evidence of immigration status because it's more prejudicial than probative, to stop imposing legal financial obligations on people who cannot pay them, to diversify the bench and our staff, to make sure that as we learn things from COVID, that we perpetuate those things we've learned and we use them even after the pandemic subsides, making people have to come to court less often, allowing them to appear virtually, notifying them electronically of their need to appear rather than a piece of paper in the mail that may go to an old address. It's necessary that our system evaluate itself so that everyone can have faith in the system, because our democracy only works if we believe that it is just. I think we should do our best to avoid using law to resolve our problems when we can, because a court, like any other institution, may attempt to perpetuate itself. I think it's better that we not see ourselves as the answer to the problems in society. Better that we not say we need the power to punish you for your own good. I beg you to keep children away from me and my colleagues. Though we may mean well, I don't think judges are good for children. I don't think police are good for children. Some of us think we need the power to lock a child up who is called a truant, or a child who is a runaway or with a drug problem, that we lock them up for their own good. I suggest it would be more humane and probably less expensive to make school a place where all kids want to be, to make drug and mental health treatment available regardless of ability to pay. Our arms may not be connected to our hearts, but we must work to attach them. For drug users, we congratulate ourselves for the safety valve of drug court. And some people certainly have been helped by drug court. But the cudgel of incarceration that sometimes we judges hold so dear may be what makes certain users take treatment, but it is an expensive and harsh way to provide the opportunity. And we must balance that against the hundreds of thousands of lives that have been ruined by the war on drugs, by a war that made it a felony to have a crack pipe with the residue of crack in the smoke stuck to the sides. Indeed, many cases were brought before me when I was a Superior Court judge, charging a felony resulting in years of prison for a crack addict who simply had a glass pipe in their pocket that they had used to smoke the drugs. They would tell you, my drugs are gone, I smoked them all. Yet that pipe itself resulted in a felony. But let me pause to say something about why it's so important to examine the criminalization of drug use. 40% of those charged with simple drug possession in King County were Black. Blacks are only 7% of King County. But whites use drugs at the same rate as Blacks, and frankly are more likely to be dealers than Blacks. Yet the criminal justice system has criminalized the use by Blacks far more than the use by whites. We must ask the hard questions about why that is, and more importantly, why we tolerated it for so long. My views on these matters might not be popular. I assure you they are sincerely held. I advocate that we give up power, not consolidate it, that we consider as a goal ultimately shrinking the judicial branch and the executive branch, that we measure success not by adding another judge or police officer or prosecutor or defender, but by reducing the very need for all of us. I believe deeply in the promise of this nation, even if we didn't mean it to apply to me and to many of you I see on the screen before me. But I also agree with Common, who wrote in the words of the theme song to the movie Selma, quote, "Justice for all just ain't specific enough." And if you don't understand what Common means by those words, I suggest you're not trying hard enough. We must make the promise of true justice a reality for everyone. That must be so regardless of race, religion, gender, or who we love. I suggest we must risk our very own power, our own reputation, and our comfort to make that promise true for everyone. You see, the founders expressed lofty principles. Those principles are now our principles. So help us make it true. Help us make it specific enough. Help us connect our arms not just to our brains, but to our hearts. Thank you for letting me be here today.
Wow. I'm not sure how to follow that up, but I will try my very best. Thank you so much. And lots of questions are rolling in and we've got tons of time. So this will be great. Thank you so much for being here today. Let's start with, tell us about your experience with Rotary while you were in Japan.
Thank you. I mentioned before that I was fortunate enough to be a Rotary Scholar. I got the Rotary International Scholarship Award, which was 21 months of study in Japan. And I lived and traveled the country and eventually spent time in Sapporo, in Hokkaido in the north, studying international trade. But my real motivation to be there was my love of Japanese ceramics. And so I bought a motorcycle and I traveled to pottery villages all throughout the country to learn about firing techniques, glazing techniques. So that was my side gig while I was there. I also got to speak at Rotary clubs throughout Japan. And I joined the speech contest that was held every year and came in first place for a speech I delivered in Japanese. And tonight at about 5 o'clock, the other scholarship recipients and I are having our regular check-in with each other. All these years hence, more than 30 years later, we still care about each other, check in on each other, and we're from all over the US and the world who joined together in Japan and have connected and continue to hold dear the relationship and experiences we had together way back then. So thank you for that question.
Ken, you're on mute.
Jen Levy adds also that I'm a Leadership Tomorrow graduate, and that's true. I was in Leadership Tomorrow in, I think it was 1996 or 4. I've forgotten which year, but thank you, Jen.
I was just happy to get up this morning, so it's all relative. What does it mean to care about other human beings?
I'm sorry, can you say that again, Ken?
What does it mean to you to care for other human beings?
Yeah, I think what it means is not just to assume things about other human beings, but to take the time to listen and not to think we have the answer, but to ask what the answer is, to listen more than we speak. Because I don't think we really are going to find answers together unless we've heard each other. And I think that what we'll find is that diversity is better on every single measure. When we have a heterogeneous group, it's going to be better than a homogeneous group. But it's not going to be better on every single measure. I have to qualify that. It won't be more efficient. It's going to take longer. Studies of juries have said the same thing. When you have a mixed jury, and by mixed I mean even on gender, socioeconomic class, whatever the measure is, when you have a diverse jury, they are more likely to actually listen to the judge's instructions, to read those instructions, to speak to one another, and to review the evidence carefully. On every single measure in those studies, they came to more just outcomes based on the instructions and the evidence than the homogeneous test groups did, except for one measure. They took longer. So let's allow ourselves to take a little bit longer to come to a full decision and to listen to each other. And I'll add to that answer that we often talk about civility and the need to be polite. I think sometimes we miss the point when we talk about civility, because I don't care much about etiquette and politeness. It really isn't what's important to me, because I think true civility is respect. And that means allowing people to get emotional if they're upset about things. It means maybe raising difficult questions, which sometimes isn't seen as polite, because we're not going to get anywhere unless we face these problems together and actually talk about the substance of it, even if it's hard.
Okay. What suggestions do you have for Seattle Rotary members and our club as a whole to support the initiatives you are describing?
Well, I think the scholarship program that I benefited from years ago was an excellent one. I'm not sure whether you're providing scholarships to people from disadvantaged backgrounds now, but giving to those programs and then having those students come and speak to you about what they're studying and why. where they come from, what their hopes and what their dreams are. I think that is so important. The community involvement that you represent is also key. Making sure that we don't assume, like, you know, the judicial branch assumes that the ability to put you in jail is what we need. Sometimes the business community thinks that a business has all the answers. The social worker thinks that more social workers is the answer. I think all of us expanding beyond what we know and listening and creating that multidisciplinary approach to things is what we need now, which is why Rotary is so able to do that, because you come from all different walks of life. You have together a group of people that is diverse and can be more diverse to help us find answers and to listen to each other.
Well, kudos to us then, because we do that, and it is by far one of the most popular programs throughout our year. And we do listen, we do greet, we do hear, we do, you know, we hear stories that most of us probably can't relate to. So I'm glad to hear you say that. That makes us feel a bit better. Can you tell us about your personal and professional journey that led you to the Supreme Court?
Well, as I mentioned in my remarks, I was the first to college. And so when I was a young man, I started working at about 14. And my first job was cleaning the restrooms in public parks. I might have misrepresented my age so that I would be 16 rather than 14. But I think the statute of limitations has passed on that by now. But I cleaned the public restrooms driving a three-wheeled Cushman cart from park to park. And as you can imagine, public restrooms are not pretty places. They don't smell very good. And I thought, as I rode from park to park, that as honest as this labor might be, it's not what I want to do for the rest of my life. So that's when I decided I was going to go to college. And I didn't have a good high school counselor. I want to emphasize how important it is to support our kids and give them the help that they need to get to the next level. I unfortunately did not have that. And so I decided to apply to college on my own without help from counselors. And at the time I lived in Claremont, California, where there are 5 colleges. So I decided I was going to go and apply to the first college I could find. And I walked into the admissions office and I asked for an application. You might remember paper. Back then you filled out paper applications. And the woman behind the desk, she looked at me and she said, "Well, is it for you?" And of course I said, "Yeah, it's for me." And she said, "Well, Scripps is a women's college." Unfortunately, I had walked into the one college that wasn't co-ed. So I almost gave up, but instead I walked to the next college, which turned out to be Pitzer. And having learned from my mistake, my first question was, are you co-ed? And when I found out they were, I applied early admission, and that's where I went. So I only applied ever to one college. I loved college. Initially, for me, it was utilitarian. School was so that I didn't have to be a janitor my whole life. But when I got there, I loved learning just for its own sake and found study abroad to be a wonderful opportunity. I studied in Japan and China, and then went back to Japan on the Rotary scholarship, and then went to law school. You'd think I would have learned from the first experience, but it worked out okay. I only applied to one law school. I applied to UC Berkeley, and thank goodness I got in, and that's where I went to school. My self-knowledge was so profoundly poor that I thought I wanted to be an international business lawyer and did not want to do litigation. And so I did that for the first 5 years. I worked with companies from Japan and Taiwan, doing business in the Northwest and other work, but I didn't enjoy it. And so I left the law firm and I joined the city attorney's office to do domestic violence prosecution, mostly elder and child abuse cases. The partner at the law firm told me I was committing career suicide. I like to remind him of that advice he gave me back then. But I did that, and then I was recruited to the U.S. Attorney's Office, where I worked by my own choice on hate crime prosecution and child trafficking cases. And then I worked on an international terrorism case. And I was happy to be there. I had no intention of doing anything else when I was recruited to apply to become a judge by counsel to the governor, and Governor Locke appointed me to a vacancy in Superior Court, where I served for 10 years before, again, I was encouraged to apply, and Governor Gregoire appointed me to this court. And since I've had 2 contested elections, which fortunately I was successful in, and I serve here now. One of the real important parts of this for me has been involvement in mentoring, in diversity work, in access to justice work with the Access to Justice Board, which I served on for nearly 8 years. And as I mentioned before in my remarks, I really believe in the promise of this nation. And I think it's incumbent on all of us to bring us closer to it, even though we're imperfect yet.
So that's an awesome journey. Let me go back for just 30 seconds, if I may. And speaking of mentoring, what is it that your school counselor said to you that was so deflating that you had to rock it against?
Well, I went in, I think I was a sophomore, and I had some B's together with A's, and I thought I could do better, and I was going to get advice about how to improve. And when I sat down, she said, "It's so nice to see students like you doing well in school," which let me know that I had already exceeded any expectations she had for me, and she didn't know me from Adam. So why was I surpassing what obviously had to have been low expectations for her? So I decided that we didn't have anything in common. I didn't respect her, and I wasn't going back. This is how, I think I was 13 and a half at the time. This is how I reacted. It's a stubbornness that has both helped and hurt me in my life, and may still be part of my character.
Yeah, maybe one of the better things that did happen to you, right? All right, next question. What are your thoughts or current efforts to reduce funding of the police?
Well, I don't get to make those decisions. I'm not part of the budgeting, either at the city, county, or state or federal level. What I would like to do is reduce the need for law enforcement. And I think that if we have drug treatment and mental health treatment, and we have a softer response to many problems that people have, we have people with a taser, a firearm, and handcuffs showing up to a mental health crisis. I'm not sure that's the right answer. So I want us to be thoughtful, and I want to encourage the legislative and executive branches to think carefully about what really is going to have the best return. And when I mean the best return, I mean in outcomes that are healthy and productive for society. All of us have a role to play, and it's not my job to say eliminate or defund. It's my job to say we have to think about this carefully, and we have to make sure that we have all the voices there in the room when we talk about it.
Yeah, all right. I like this question. I love all the questions, but this one I was wanted to ask myself. What are the 2 most pressing challenges as a Chief Justice, and what have been your 2 most important successes as a Chief Justice?
Well, I've only been chief since January, so it's kind of difficult to expect a whole bunch of successes so far. But what we're facing right now is what justice looks like with what we've learned from the pandemic. Are we going to take the lessons that have been hard fought and apply them as we go forward? Are we going to recognize that sometimes people need protection orders and they haven't been able to get them? That we don't communicate well with our tribal courts so that if they issue a protective order, we know about it, and vice versa. We have some difficult challenges. Some of them are technological. Some of them are simply that it's hard to change big institutions. It's hard to change mindsets. That's what we're facing. In terms of successes, we, I think, have successfully responded to this difficult pandemic by being nimble, by being aggressively progressive in how we allow people to adjudicate their disputes despite the difficulties of the pandemic. And we've been meeting and talking more than we ever did. It's one of the positive side effects of this horrible pandemic. We now meet weekly with presiding judges from across the state and talk about what's happening, how we can fix it, how we can improve, and how we can work together. And in June, we're going to have the first ever judicial summit, which includes the other 2 branches of government, to talk about how we can work and communicate better with one another while still respecting the separation of powers, because there are some things we can't talk about, but there are many things we can do together. And I think we have improved the relationships among the three branches of government, and I'm very hopeful for the future.
So this next question kind of dovetails into that. What suggestions do you have for ensuring that our judges represent the other ethnic groups who make up our country?
Can you say that again, please?
What suggestions do you have for ensuring that our judges represent the other ethnic groups who make up our country?
Well, for years, I've been working on recruiting people to be judges, just as I was recruited by people like Justice C.Z. Smith back when I was a young lawyer. They reached out and said, think about this. So I've been involved in recruiting folks, in training folks, and encouraging them to apply, and then mentoring them when they're new judges. I've been encouraging the evaluation committees to do more outreach, to encourage more people to apply. And we have seen a great change in who's applying and who's being appointed. And there are other groups who are doing that as well. There's a judicial training for pro tems and for teaching people how to run campaigns and to be judges. And then we do educational sessions during our judicial conferences that focus on diversity and inclusion and do more than just teach about implicit bias, but get us to the point where we're contemplating solutions and recommendations. Because I don't think it's enough just to learn about implicit bias and pat yourself on the back for that education, because the studies show that simply studying implicit bias makes you worse than you were before. It's counterintuitive, but simply learning about implicit bias without action steps to correct it brings us backwards.
Yeah, all right. What's your view on corporations having the same rights as people? To me, not me, the question, it signals the end of democracy.
Well, they can't have the same rights. They're corporations, which implies that they have a body, but they don't actually. And I like the Stephen Colbert with Justice Stevens vignette that you may have seen, where Justice Stevens takes a drink of water and says, can a corporation do that? There are differences. There will always be differences. There are similarities, and there will always be similarities.
Here's a quick shout out. People are listening to your words. It's clear that your arms are attached to your heart. Quick kudo. Justice, your area is one of three pillars of our government, along with the Congress and the President. What is your current view of maintaining the balance between all three?
Well, our job is a serious one. It requires that we not be subject to fear about retribution for decisions we make. We have to make those decisions even if they're unpopular. And we're in a difficult place in this state. We have chosen populism, that is the election of judges over the appointment. And there are pros and cons, but if we're going to continue, and I'm just speaking about my branch now, if we're going to continue to elect judges, we need to do better to educate the public about those candidates and what it is that makes a good judge. Because as I campaign, I'm frequently asked questions that make me think we're not really teaching civics well in this country. People don't really understand what my job is. We are not just an additional political body that gets to second guess another political body. Our job is to make decisions even if we don't like the outcome, because that's what happens when you apply these facts to these laws. That in fact is our job. So I do a great deal of speaking in schools. I have gone as early as kindergarten to talk about the judicial branch and what we do. I spoke at one preschool, and when I told the director there that I had a PowerPoint, he said, I don't think you understand. These are preschool students. I said, no, trust me. And I had a PowerPoint designed for kids to understand exactly what it is that we do. And some of the slides included my own children in phases of their lives. And I had them laughing and joking and talking about the rule of law. So I think it's incumbent on all of us to not forget civics matter and to make sure that we're teaching and understanding them and engaging in the democratic process.
Yeah, there might be a future judge in that group. How might you influence legislators to put heart into the laws they make?
There's an interesting movement to require something akin to a fiscal note, but on racial justice. That is, every time there's a proposed piece of legislation, it has to be evaluated for the disproportional effect that it might have when implemented. That's hard work. It might even be expensive work, but I think it's a good way for us to evaluate what we're actually doing. Because something can be facially neutral, but in effect is going to have a disproportionate outcome. And it's important for us to study that and acknowledge that before we pass new laws and new rules. The judicial branch can do the same thing with the rules that we adopt.
All right, we've only got a couple of minutes left, but we've got some really good questions left too. There's a meme going around social media. If the penalty for crime is a fine, then that law only exists if you're poor. The person asking that question is curious of your comments on that.
There's a couple of quotes that I like about the law. One is that the law in its majestic equality forbids equally the rich and the poor from sleeping under bridges, from stealing bread, and from begging in the street. I think there's something to that quote. If we simply find people who are already impoverished, what are we accomplishing with that fine? It's another example, in my view, of the need to evaluate a law that imposes a fine about what the disproportionate effect of that might be. And what is it that we're actually trying to accomplish? If we're fining somebody for leaving a vehicle parked in a certain point, do we really think that that fine is going to dissuade the person whose car has broken down from leaving it there? Of course it won't. What are we trying to accomplish? We're trying to accomplish helping those folks have other options. That's what I think we need to focus on. How do we actually fix the underlying problem?
Okay. Last question. How do you feel about the election of judges in Washington state?
Well, pardon me for being tongue-in-cheek. They say it's a choice between the ignorant masses or the corrupt few, whether you appoint or elect judges. There's a downside to either system, and it goes back to the answer that I gave before. I don't think there's any prospect for us appointing instead of electing, and appointing has its own problems, as we can see. I just think we need to educate ourselves. We need to do the reading, share the information, and you're all people of influence. If there's a judicial contest, I want you to study it and send it out to all your friends. Ask Faith Ireland who you think it should be if you don't want to do the research yourself. She's pretty astute on these questions. But once you've figured out who you think the better candidate is, provide them a forum. Invite them to your book club. Invite them to Rotary just to hear from them. It is important that we understand this very important branch of our government.
Chief Justice Gonzalez, thank you so much for your comments today. Incredible, incredible. If you've got a second, I would have you look through the chat, because not only are there lots of kudos for you, there's also a lot more questions that unfortunately I did not get to today. So I don't know if you've got the chance to look at them, take some praise, maybe answer some questions. That would be fantastic.
And Judge, let me add on behalf of the entire membership, our appreciation for you spending your time with us today with your powerful thoughts and words. And when you're ready to give back to Rotary in the form of joining a club, we'd like to be first in line.
Thank you. Is there a way to preserve the comments, save them and send them to me so I can read them? If you can do that, please.
We will get them to you.
Thank you.
You just want to see the praise ones. I know it. I knew it. I knew it.
No editing. Right. Unfiltered, please. Unfiltered.
No, we'll send them to you for sure. All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
All right. A quick shout out to our gold sponsor, Bob Alexander, who, as you've heard me say before, without his help and the help of other sponsors, would not have us watch this and share it with others. I saw your note, Jaime, on our YouTube channel. If you're interested in becoming a sponsor, please get hold of Carolyn. Bob, as always, thank you and have a great Cinco de Mayo.